All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ryan Eberly. I'm the Air Quality Program Manager for Gila River Indian Community. Um, I've got a little presentation for you on kind of the history and of our air quality program. It's a lot of slides, and yeah, it should be good though. I gave this at ASU back in February, so it took me a little time to remember what I was talking about. So let's go. All right, so this kind of covers some of the topics that I'll be covering or at least touching on. The purpose of this airplane was to remind me that this is not meant to be really a detailed discussion on any one of these items. Some will be a little bit more detailed than others, but I am going to touch on uh, most of these and probably a few more that I forgot to put on here. So this is really the 30,000 foot view. I also wanted to have just a couple of acknowledgments. I started with the tribe back in 2014, and most of what I'm covering was done up until that point. So this is just some of the people that were involved in this air program from the very beginning. A bunch of DEQ staff. There are Leroy is still in our program, and Will's now our director. Janet is over in waste. Pat is no longer with DEQ, but she is involved with tribal affairs. And then Dan retired, and Russell is no longer with our program. But these were really key people, in addition to community members, leadership, council, our attorney Roger Furlan, who's now retired, many folks at EPA, and some air agencies. So just wanted to throw out some acknowledgments for the hard work for these people. So a little history on Gila River, established in 1859 by executive order. We are, I think, maybe somewhere in the top 10 most populous tribes for on-reservation population. Total is probably close to 22,000, and about half of that live on reservation. The tribe itself, 374,000 acres, and about 10% of that is agricultural land. We do have one industrial park, down from a high of 3, but I believe this is the largest industrial park on tribal lands. And in addition to that, we have a couple of aggregate mines with some rock products facilities. All told, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 plus facilities that will be regulated under us. In addition, we have 3 regulatory air monitoring sites. So this is just kind of an overview of the community, the boundaries there in green. You can see just south of the Phoenix metropolitan area, very rural, at least the community is. The metropolitan area is not. The little red stars are our monitoring sites. And we have Ozone and PM10 at the St. John's. This is on the west end. In the middle, we have Casablanca, which is PM10, and then Saccatone, which is Ozone and PM10. These little blue things represent our sand and gravel mines, which are these 2 facilities here, and then our industrial park up here on the north side of the community. So we'll dig into a little history here. This first section is the pre-1990 Clean Air Act amendments. So in 1966, Gila River established 3 industrial parks on the community. These were largely a result of some economic development grants that were available, I believe in conjunction with BIA. And what these were intended to do is help employ community members. Gila River, because of its proximity to Phoenix, was a very favorable location. And so that's why we started up these 3 industrial parks. We still have one facility that was part of the original tenants back in the 60s. So in 1967, this is important, the state of Arizona basically said they were going to control air quality on all the reservations. And it wasn't just a memo or a policy, this actually went into state statute. So this started in 1967. In 1970, many of you may know, is when we had the Clean Air Act was passed. And in 1972, our first major source of air pollution, Pomalco, started on the community. And this is a secondary aluminum facility. They do melt aluminum and then they make ingots and so forth. And they do some fabrication as well. This facility is still here. In 1973, because of the passage of the Clean Air Act, states had to choose non-attainment area boundaries for the criteria pollutants. And Arizona and Maricopa County began operating TSP monitors in the area. And they started one at near our St. John's monitor on the community. This is not something I think anybody really ever knew about, at least current staff, until we started doing some historical digging maybe about a year ago or a year and a half ago. And we did find that this monitor was operated by Maricopa County on tribal lands. The star, I've got a few of these slides or little boxes that have little symbols. This denotes a starting and an ending period. So there will be a corresponding ending period for this. Also, we had a hazardous waste facility open up. This was a treatment and storage facility in our largest industrial park. That opened in 1975. And in 76, the TSP, total suspended particulate monitor, shut down. This is coarse, very coarse particle dust monitor. So we have 3 years of data from that monitor. Interestingly, of all the monitors that Maricopa County operated for TSP, the one at St. John's was one of the highest, if not the highest monitor. And a large part of that was due to how it was sited at an old school that was unpaved, a lot of dirt parking lots and so forth. In 1977, this actually doesn't get much news or much airtime, but you know, the Clean Air Act was amended or revised, which established some new boundaries, requirements for some new boundaries. EPA actually issued a state implementation plan for TSP for the Phoenix area. So this is prior to the state really getting involved and setting things up. In 1978, the EPA actually said, okay, all of Maricopa County is going to be non-attainment for TSP and ozone. And that actually included the portion of the Gila River Indian community that's in Maricopa County. We do split 2 counties. And the state came back and said, well, we think that area is too big. We're going to recommend what they called this urban planning area, which also still included Gila River. So here's a picture of or a graphic of the non-attainment area boundary for TSP. And the reason this is important is this really sets the precedent for non-attainment area boundaries for particulate matter and ozone. So you can see here in green, is where the Gila River Indian community is, the northern portion. And I put a little star by our TSP monitor that was operated. This is one of the reasons I believe Gila River was included, is because of this monitor that was there. Yeah, so a year later, EPA accepted those new boundaries for both TSP and ozone. So here we have the first official ozone and coarse particulate non-attainment area boundary. Not much happened really of note for the next 8 years or so, but in 1987, for those of you that don't know, EPA passed the new PM10 standard. This was both an annual standard and a 24-hour standard. So that's an important date right there. So these next slides are really Gila River's growing air quality awareness. So this is where the tribe really starts to become aware of air quality issues, but also things that have been going on that the tribe has not been involved with. So the other thing that happened in 1987 as part of the new PM10 standard, actually I think it was in the same document, EPA identified these groups, 3 groups, Group 1, Group 2, and Group 3, with the likelihood of basically Group 1 was the group that would likely exceed the new PM10 NAAQS. Now, up until this point, PM10 monitors were not very common. There might have been a couple around, but a lot of this data was based on what the TSP monitors had indicated. So that's why they had basically designed these groups to assign the likelihood of exceeding the NAAQS. So the Phoenix planning area was designated as Group 1. Now, there's no definition of Phoenix planning area. It was just a term at this point. Group 2 would have been might exceed the NAAQS, and then Group 3 was unlikely. Also important is in '87 is the Clean Water Act was amended to include treatment as a state for tribes. So this kind of sets the precedent for tribes becoming, exercising sovereignty in regulating environmental issues on their lands. So in 1989, Gila River received treatment as a state under Clean Water Act 106. So 1990, important year here. I've got a couple different boxes. What happened in October is EPA defined Group 1. And this was actually the legal definition of what Group 1 included. And it was, part of Maricopa County, but also included Gila River. In 1990, we had, in November, we had the Clean Air Act amendments. This was a landmark revision to the Clean Air Act. And what it did is for the Phoenix planning area, it solidified that basically how those boundaries were drawn back in October. It solidified them as by operation of law. And what that means is because it's now law, the only way to change that boundary is by an act of Congress. So Gila River is now included into this boundary. Since then, most designations that are done by EPA are usually put in a federal register. They can be changed. EPA can make those edits, but this particular one, there were other designations done in the Clean Air Act amendments for other pollutants, but this is really the only one where you see that language. This also authorized, the amendments also authorized EPA to treat tribes in a manner similar as states. So also treatment as a state for air quality. So here's just a picture of what the new PM10 non-attainment area boundary looked like. This nice big rectangle, which is all in Maricopa County except for this little pimple over here that's part of Pinal. But you can see the northern portion of Gila River is included in that non-attainment area boundary. For reference, I'll pull up the 79 TSP boundary in yellow here. So this shows what that was like. So it grew a little bit. It's also a lot easier to define a boundary with nice straight lines. So in 1993, we had a medical waste incinerator move in and start up operations. So now, at this point in the mid-90s, we have many facilities. These are just some photos of the three that I've talked about thus far. We have our medical waste incinerator here on the left, and on the right, we have our hazardous waste treatment storage facility. And then the bottom here is just a picture of the Pomelco facility creating their aluminum logs. So because all these facilities had moved in and tribes' growing awareness of environmental issues, the Department of Environmental Quality was established in 1995. And in 1996, we received our first Clean Air Act 103 grant for the air quality program. There were a number of items identified or projects identified in there. Also in that same year, the Phoenix nonattainment area was reclassified from moderate, which is what it would have started out as, to serious because it failed to meet the national standard within a specific time frame. Now, up until this point, the tribe has really not been consulted on any of these issues. So this is something that was done with very little, if any, consultation with the tribe. In 1997, we had some new NACs for ozone, for 8-hour ozone. Also, some PM 2.5 standards were set up in 1997. So then in 1998, we completed our some objectives under that 103 grant. We had a needs assessment that was put together, an initial emission inventory, and also an initial round of facility inspections. In that same year, EPA also finalized the Tribal Authority Rule, or TAR, which basically allowed tribes to develop their own air quality regulations. This was a landmark document, landmark rule, and really kind of started the development of a lot of air quality regulation, air quality monitoring within tribal communities. In that same year, also, Gila River applied for a 105 grant, which is an ongoing operating grant, to develop our set of rules or tribal implementation plan. So prior to the Tribal Authority Rule, this is kind of how permitting was set up, at least facilities that needed air quality permits. Under this new source review program for EPA, you have major sources here on the right and in the middle, and the difference being whether or not it's a major source in attainment area or a major source in a non-attainment area. And those really fall, that's usually by state. So you'll have local facilities, but you also have facilities on tribal lands. And so that's why we broke these out here, state and tribal. The state facilities were regulated, or at least facilities not on tribal lands were regulated by EPA or by state and local agencies being delegated. Tribal lands were usually regulated by EPA, although in some cases the states did regulate these facilities. There were a few in Arizona. Now, aside from the major sources, you also had all these other sources that were considered minor sources or area sources. Generally, it depends on the area that it was in, but generally, let's say less than 100 tons per year of a criteria pollutant. Now, again, same thing. You had facilities on state, local lands and facilities on tribal lands. The state facilities were regulated, again, by the state and locals. They had minor source permitting programs set up to conduct the regulation. The problem was on tribal lands, there was not really a minor source program. EPA was really only interested in major sources. And so all the minor sources that started up on tribal lands may have gone largely unregulated. And a big issue for all of this is really just the enforcement piece, specifically for non-members. So that's why the nice thing about the TAR was kind of allowed that gap, that tribal gap, to be filled. So a few questions about developing a tribal implementation plan. So basically a set of rules to govern air quality on the tribe. This is basically the tribal version of a state implementation plan, or a SIP. So obviously and I'll speak from the perspective of Gila River. This is just to obviously strengthen tribal authority. You also have that local control over things versus EPA, and EPA Region 9, most of those people are in California. So to have that local regulation and enforcement, it fills that tribal gap. So it allowed the tribe to develop their own set of rules where there really wasn't any before. Protecting the health and human health and environment, of course. Also protecting Gila River's cultural heritage. And I mentioned before, as an agricultural society, this was very important, allowed us to tailor our rules to protect those cultural things. Also, strengthening economic development. So these were just some of the reasons why Gila River decided to develop their TIP. Now, I mentioned the cultural heritage. Gila River was historically a farming culture. And, over time, over 100 years ago, I guess, non-native settlers started to come in and really settle upstream of Gila River. And what happened is they started diverting water for their own crops. And really the river started then to dry up. So this really kind of devastated agriculture on the community as well as their local food source. In 2004, there was a landmark water rights settlement that the tribe won, which gave them an allocation of Colorado River water. And the tribe at that time really intended to expand their agricultural activities by over 100,000 acres. And if you remember the slide that I showed you toward the beginning, I mean, we still only have about 31,000 acres or so that are farmed. So largely that really hasn't come to fruition yet. Also, that allowed us to design our controls, as I mentioned earlier, to protect those cultural or traditional activities such as farming, or when you have maybe a cultural ceremony that involves burning. So those things could be protected in our rules. I'm not going to go through this slide in a lot of detail, but these were just some of the questions, that we were asking, and things that we wanted to regulate. Did we want to do only minor sources or major sources? Did we want to, basically assume delegation of enforcing, other federal standards like NSPS for mainly criteria pollutants, or the NESHAP for hazardous pollutants? These were things that we asked ourselves when we put together, how to put together the scope of the TIP. So here's our plan objectives for the TIP development. And there was a number of them, basically hiring a staff. We did want to designate ourselves as unclassifiable for that new ozone NAAQS. We needed to put together a discussion paper. And also, how were we going to do outreach? We knew that was an important piece of developing a new set of rules on the community. How are we going to convey that, get input from everybody? Also, just the initial council approval to put together the elements and the approaches. Then once we had them together and we developed that TIP, putting it out for public notice, we knew we were going to receive a lot of comments, so we had to put together a responsiveness summary, and then finally revise those rules and send them back through council for approval, for final approval. Okay, so this next timeline is on the development of the TIP, some, I guess, major milestones and some other things that went on during that time period. So we're picking up here in the late 90s. Gila River recommended that unclassifiable for the ozone standard and PM10, because at that point we didn't have any monitors on the community. Then in 2000, we were asked to submit basically these 11 factor analysis to support that designation of unclassifiable for ozone. So we did prepare that document and submit that to EPA. Just as a little aside, I mentioned that the non-attainment area for PM10 was now serious, which meant that Maricopa County, or the state for that area, had to start controlling additional sources. And one of those additional sources was ag, which comprised a fairly significant piece of the valley back in the 90s and early 2000s. So there was a set of rules put together for agricultural activities. We call these best management practices because, well, it's not really a permit. And in 2002 is when we started monitoring, and again, this is regulatory monitoring for ozone. We also started, we did some monitoring for PM 2.5 at the same time at our two sites on both on the west end in St. John's and on the east end in Saskatoon. Also in 2002, we finished developing section 1 of our TIP. And basically section 1 contains these 4 items. We have a bunch of definitions of what things are, the general authority of the tribe to regulate air quality, also the just general procedures for adoption of the rules, and then finally adoption of the national ambient air quality standards. So this is what we were going to regulate against or using. We could have gone more stringent, but we did not. We stuck with the federal max. So finishing out 2002, the tribe actually administered I guess issued the first administrative order under our medical waste ordinance. And I believe this is the first tribal administrative order that had been issued for really anything environmental on tribal lands. And basically what that did is required them to put some controls on their incinerator for the medical waste. And, as a result of that and a few other issues later on in that year, they actually shut down that medical waste incinerator. And then this is where we see EPA begin to start developing their tribal minor NSR. So these are the rules for minor sources on tribal lands. That begins in 2002. In 2003, we submitted some supplemental ozone data. So remember, we had been monitoring for ozone now for, I think we had a little less than a year's worth of data. And we were able to submit that to EPA to support this unclassifiable recommendation for the 97 standard. Also in that year, our PM 2.5 monitoring ended. We did not see any significant PM 2.5 concentrations. In 2004, we finally got that designation of attainment for the 1997 ozone standard as a result of these previous activities. And then in 2005, the EPA approved our request for a 1-hour ozone boundary change. So this is the first time where we see us and maybe any tribe be removed from a non-attainment area boundary. part of the reason for this is that that standard kind of went away, but also we just provided enough evidence to exclude ourselves from a previous designation. And we had started monitoring for PM10 in 2005 as well at our Casablanca site, which is kind of in the middle there of the community by a lot of agricultural activities. And that was a filter-based monitor, I believe 1 in 3 day. In 2006, this was kind of a landmark year. Council finally approved our set of rules, or our air quality management plan, which is a TIP. The TIP, there are only certain things that can be approved under a TIP. Our AQMP actually contains some additional items that aren't approvable under a TIP, which is why we call it an AQMP, but it's essentially our implementation plan. Also, we requested EPA approval for treatment as a state in 2006 for air quality. So this slide just shows what was in that AQMP, or our set of rules. We have 7 parts, and there are subparts to these parts. Really, the 2 biggest pieces, or I should say, the main contents of the TIP are in part 2, which includes all of the requirements for permitting. We have some sections in here for dust. You know, some open burning. We have fugitive dust and visible emissions. That's to control dust on the community. Because remember, we are in a PM10 non-attainment area on the north side of the community. So we had to have appropriate level dust controls that were similar to those in the neighboring agency to the north. The nice thing about being excluded from the ozone non-attainment area is it allowed us to relax our controls for ozone precursors, volatile organic compounds, nitrogen oxides. It allowed us to relax controls on that. So our controls are not as stringent for VOCs as they would have been had we still been in that non-attainment area. But we do have some controls for VOCs and for solvents. And then, you know, individual source type controls are down in section 7. The main one here is aggregate processing. We probably use that the most because of the mines and the concrete batch plants and hot mix asphalt plants on the facility, on the community. So this next set of, I guess, next timeline is really the implementation of this AQMP that we have. And there's obviously some other things that we'll talk about in there as well. So in 2007, we submitted that AQMP to EPA because we wanted it to be federally enforceable, not just locally enforceable or tribally enforceable. The hazardous waste facility that had started in 1975 had its lease denied. So that facility, there's some remediation issues associated with that facility, but it closed. And also we started issuing our first earth moving and burn permits underneath our new set of rules. So in 2008, well, I'll say in 2007, EPA also asked us to make some revisions to the AQMP before they could approve it. So we did that, and we resubmitted those amendments through council for approval. So that was done in 2008. Underneath our 105 grant, we revised our emission inventory. So this was a 10-year, basically a 10-year revision of emissions. We didn't see a lot of changes. There were a few just because of the way things were calculated, but not a lot of changes to the facility makeup on the community. And then also there was a new 8-hour ozone standard for 2008. So here's just a screenshot of a summary from our emission inventory. Not spend a lot of time going through this in detail. However, I'll point out that you can see mobile sources are a large part of emissions, for carbon monoxide and then these ozone precursors here. This is because I-10, Interstate 10, runs through the middle of the community, and that's a main thoroughfare between Phoenix and Tucson. Also point out that in these calculations that we put together, we did not estimate emissions from vacant land or native desert. And this could be a big component of PM10 because a large part of the community is rural. In 2009, actually EPA approved our treatment as a state application. So that was, we were really excited about that. There's a number of things that you need to submit to get treatment as a state. One of them is identifying your reservation boundaries. Now, many boundaries are either nice straight lines off of, say, township and ranges, or they're based off of rivers. And what we know of rivers is that they change course over time. And so what we found is that between when the reservation was created and current day, the course of the Salt River on the northwesternmost part of the community had changed. And so we needed to finish or at least verify that boundary before we could proceed with treatment as a state. So that was an issue that had to be resolved. These are the 6 items that we requested treatment as a state for. Our set of minor source rules under Section 110 of the Clean Air Act, new source performance standards for individual source types under Section 111, national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants under Section 112, Title V permitting program, also affected state notifications. So this is important even for tribes that do not want to regulate sources on their community. By having the affected state notification, if a major source begins operation or is planned for operation or changes their operation and the permit changed, the adjacent agency needs to notify any affected states. So if a tribe has treatment as a state, the tribe will need to be notified. And I believe it's a 50-mile radius, I think. Also, we wanted the ability to make our own air quality designation. So this is also important for tribes, especially if you just have monitoring as opposed to any sources. So that's under Section 107D. So in 2009, we also started issuing our first non-Title V or minor source air quality permits for facilities. I think we started with some of the sand and gravel mines and then a few of the concrete batch plants that were around. Also kind of important is EPA initiated a redesignation for Pinal County, PM10 and PM2.5. At the time, Pinal County had the worst PM10 monitor in the country. And because of a lot of pressure from environmental groups and so forth, EPA started this redesignation process. Generally, EPA does not go back and relook at data unless the data shows a significant change in air quality. So that's why it's very important when a new standard comes out and you submit that initial designation recommendation that you can get attainment or unclassifiable status. Because even if you start not attaining the standard, unless it's consistent, EPA may not go back and redesignate you. I'm not saying they won't, but in this case, they did because the monitors were so bad. As part of that process, Gila River got involved because, you know, the lower 2/3 of our community is in Pinal County. So EPA had asked us for a designation recommendation as well for PM10. In 2011, EPA finally approved our air quality management plan. So now it was federally enforceable. The one thing that they did not approve is the Title V portion, because we only have that one Title V facility, and actually they've requested a non-Title V permit through us. So if that happens, we will not have a Title V facility, and we won't need Title V rules. But we did make some corrections to those rules, and they have been resubmitted for approval, just EPA is not acting on. In 2012, we were classified as attainment for the 2008 ozone max, and this is based on the monitoring data that we had from our sites. Also, we finished an exceptional events demonstration. So I mentioned the redesignation piece here. There's a lot of backstory to our portion of it, but as part of our designation recommendation, we wanted to show that the exceedances that we did have at our monitors during this time period were due to high winds, and we could exclude them from consideration. So we went through a process to prepare this document. So this is the first and maybe only one that's ever been done by a tribe. In 2013, we started monitoring officially continuous PM10 monitoring at all 3 of our sites. So instead of just the one filter-based monitor at Casablanca, we now had continuous PM10 monitors at all 3 sites. And then finally in 2014, and this is the end of my timeline, EPA finalizes their tribal minor NSR. So this had started in 2002, so you can see that is about a 12-year process. So just a few slides here to kind of show where we're at now. This is the 2008 ozone non-attainment area. You can see the portion of the community in Maricopa County up here on the north side is excluded. This is the new 2015 ozone non-attainment area. So you can see it grew just a little bit on the southeast side. Here is what the current PM10 non-attainment areas look like for Maricopa and Pinal counties. Those are identified in blue. You can see our portion here in Pinal County is unclassifiable still. EPA has deferred this designation so far, but the north part is still encompassed in the Maricopa County or Phoenix non-attainment area up on the north side. This slide just shows the difference in the permitting thresholds between our set of rules that we developed back in the early 2000s and EPA's set of rules that they have developed. So these are the permitting thresholds, which basically means the amount of pollutants you can emit before you need a permit. So for us, most of them are about 1 ton per year. So it's pretty low compared to EPA's. For non-attainment areas, they would be about 5 tons per year. And for attainment areas, they would be about 10 tons per year. The one difference where we are less stringent than EPA is in lead. Ours is still 1 ton and EPA's is 0.1 ton. We do not have any lead sources on the community, so this is irrelevant. But as we proceed with revising our rules, we may change these values or that value. This last slide just shows some of the monitoring data that we've had over the years for PM10. Generally, the slide on the left here shows the annual averages. So this includes all the high pollution days that we have due to a lot of dust storms and so forth. You can see a couple of dips in here for 2015 and actually for last year, which were wet years, which really helps the concentrations. Actually in 2019 was pretty much the lowest concentrations we've seen since 2013. So that was kind of nice. Slide on the right shows the exceedances. These are largely due to exceptional events, high wind. You can see on both the green line on both and the green bars, that's our Casablanca site. Remember I mentioned this was in an agricultural area of the community. So we do see a lot more higher concentrations and more exceedances at this particular site. 2019 was a good year though, nice and calm. And this year's very similar. Last slide here is just on some future activities that we're working on. Most of these should be kicking off sometime this year. We are going to start revising our rules. Remember I mentioned these were probably back in 2006. Most of them a little edits in 2008, but they're about 10, 15 years old. Also, we're going to conduct a couple of high wind inventories for our St. John's and Casablanca sites. And this is really just to identify sources that are contributing to the dust concentrations, the PM10 concentrations at these two sites during high wind events. And what that'll allow us to do is then assess whether we need to start looking at controls for these types of sources. So if we identify that they're largely agricultural in nature, we will look at agricultural controls. If we identify that they're, a lot of it is just native desert, not much we can do there, but this is something we're going to do for this year, these high wind inventories. Also revise our own emission inventories. So this is for all pollutants on the community. We will include the vacant land. We want to get some additional delegation for some of these NSPS and NESHAPs. Our rules basically say that we've adopted all of these as of about 2008. So there's been a number of NSPS and NESHAPs that have been added since then that we don't really officially have delegation for. Specifically, there's one 6C for gas stations. So we have about 10 gas stations on the community. And then I just have a bullet for a few other items on here of various degrees of importance, looking at that separation for the Phoenix Nonattainment area, our portion in there. Some dust studies on the highways that's been proposed by a couple of external groups. We are looking at wild horse management. That is a contributing factor that we've identified, or a possible contributing factor to dust on the community. There are a number of wild horses herds, and when they're roaming around and breaking up the soil crust, then it becomes more erodible or entrainable for wind. And then largely, I mentioned before, just agricultural BMPs is yet to be determined whether this will be voluntary or a rule-driven process. So anyway, that's the presentation for you. I've got my contact information here if anybody needs to get a hold of me. The QR code here actually will take you to our website for current air quality and visibility conditions on the community for our 3 sites. So this is something that we implemented about a year or a year and a half ago, and just as an outreach tool, but also for people that are doing work, they can, especially maybe even farms. We know some of the farms use it to assess not only the meteorological conditions, but also potentially if they might be having an impact at one of our monitors. So that's there for people to use. So I think we've got maybe about 9 or 10 minutes or so for some questions. And I have not been monitoring the chat, so I don't know if that's something.
Great job, Ryan. I have been monitoring. I haven't seen any questions come in. This is Kelly. If anyone would like to unmute their line and ask a question now, feel free to do that. Or type their question into the chat box and I can read it out.
Well, either I was really thorough and there aren't any questions, or people are eating lunch or are asleep after lunch.
I think it was very thorough. Oh, John agrees. He also says very thorough in the chat. You did get one question coming in from Trisha Frank. She asks, how many folks are in your air department?
Yeah, that's a good question, Trisha. There are, we do have myself and 4 other staff in the air quality department. About 2.5, 3 of those staff are really, 2.5 are really mainly focused on the air monitoring because of that regulatory program that does take a lot of resources. So we are doing that, and then the remaining people are used for the permitting and compliance activities.
Great. Frank Spurgeon says, great job, Ryan, and thanks for sharing.
Thanks, Frank.
If there's no more questions, we can just end a bit early.
Sounds good with me. Well,
Great.
if you guys have any questions or think of something later, feel free to email me, and I can respond that way, or call me.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.